Hero, I am so glad to be learning with you today on the Jewcurious show. And before we begin, I want you to go on a brief journey with me in your imagination. Imagine you are a woman who has focused on her education, has really worked hard to build her career, and has finally gotten to the moment where she's decided to grow her family. This is something that's not only built into our culture, this strive to have families, but it's built into our very DNA. One of the most basic yearnings of every organism is to reproduce, is to extend its legacy upon this planet. And for many people, this is something that's a strong pull that they have to put off in order to achieve other things. And this ability to procreate is something that so many people take for granted until they find out they can't, right? For one reason or another. But regardless of the reason, if this is something that's important to you, having it taken away from you can be crushing. Today, I'm talking to a colleague of mine, a rabbi from Berkeley, California, who walked this path herself and in her darkest moments sought a solution within her faith, within her people, within the Jewish world, and found that there was none. There was none that suited her. And so she decided to start an organization herself to help women and families just like hers. I'm so excited to share with you today, Rabbi Idit Solomon. Ready? Let's catch this wave.
Welcome to the Jewcurious show, where learning about Judaism and getting to know Jewish people can help you live a life of meaning, joy, human connection, and personal growth. And now your host, Rabbi John Carrier.
Thanks, Ron. Welcome back to the Jewcurious show, episode numero dos. If you're listening to this episode when it first comes out, you are in launch week, which means you also have access to episode 0, where you'll learn a little bit about me and why I made this podcast and who it's for and what you can expect to get out of it. We're also standing shoulder to shoulder with episode 1, where I speak to Rabbi Adam Greenwald. And on the other shoulder, there is episode 3 with an interview with my friend and student, Carla Jenkins. But let's just roll those shoulders and make room for this episode right here, which is episode 2. And today I am super excited to share with you the story and the wisdom and the heart and the work of Rabbi Idit Solomon. Rabbi Idit Solomon is the CEO and founder of an organization called CASAD. That is a Hebrew word. There's sort of a double meaning there. CASAD is the Hebrew word for stork. And what the organization does is it helps families who are struggling with fertility. So a stork is a good symbol for that. But it's also related to the word chesed, which is the Hebrew word for kindness, or sometimes translated as loving kindness. It's the kind of kindness that God has for God's people. In this episode, you're going to hear about how Rabbi Solomon, in her own family, struggled to have children, and from her struggles, saw a need in the Jewish world to support other families who are going through the same struggle. But I don't want to spoil it for you. What I do want you to do is go ahead and subscribe to this show. That way, if you have to turn your car off or take your dog inside or start the dishwasher, you know you could always come back and get this episode and the rest of the episodes, and we can stay connected to keep doing this learning together. And once you've done that, once you've hit that button on your phone to subscribe in the podcast application of your choice and put that phone in your pocket so you can listen to this whole episode, I want you to hang on for a great conversation with Rabbi Idit Solomon, starting now. Coming to the microphone, I have Rabbi Idit Solomon, founder and CEO of CASAD. Rabbi Solomon, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Well, I'm very happy to have you. So I just want to tell the folks, we have met before. You and I were a part of the same cohort of Rabbis Without Borders, which is a program of CLAL, not a paid sponsor, but I do want to give them props, the Center for Learning and Leadership in the Jewish World. And we met at a retreat about a year ago, I think.
Yeah.
And how was the whole Rabbis Without Borders thing for you?
It worked very well for me. I really enjoyed it. I can't compare it to any other Rabbis Without Borders cohort, but to me, it seemed pretty exceptional. Really loved the people I was with, which is just important. Get meaning out of, I think, most things. If you're with people that you value and respect. And I really thought our group was awesome.
Right. And I would corroborate that. I mean, it was pretty clear to me at the alumni retreat that ours was the best of all cohorts.
Yeah, pretty much.
Just in terms of inside jokes, sheer awesomeness, and country music chops. So not knocking any other cohort. Remember, they're not a paid sponsor, so we can say whatever we want. But no, that was a great experience for me as well. And I'm really delighted that you and I met, especially because you and I do very different kinds of work. And everybody in that cohort does kind of different kinds of rabbi-ing. And I really wanted to bring you to my audience of the Jewcurious, because I think you're doing something really exceptional and I want them to know about it. So if you wouldn't mind, why don't you give us the elevator pitch? And, it can be as long an elevator ride as you like, but tell us about the work of heceta and why you're doing it. What inspired you to start this thing?
Sure. It really starts with the name, because the name was the inspiration. And the word heceta, Hebrew for stork, but it comes from the word chesed, or it shares the root with chesed, which means loving kindness. And it came to me because my husband and I had gone through years of struggling to have children and infertility treatments and losses and lots of money. And at the time I was working in Jewish education. And if you had a Jewish child, I would give you unprecedented amounts of money and incentive to go to camp, to get free books, to go to Israel, to help with your education, to join this group. And I thought, I don't need incentive for that, but I'm about to need some money just to have the kid. And to me, it seemed that one of the most powerful forms of loving kindness was to fulfill this wish of what I think is one of the most ultimate acts of both being human and connecting with the divine, which is becoming a parent. So when we finally reached the part in our journey where we had a pregnancy that we thought was going to make it, my husband, who is conveniently enough for this purpose, a lawyer, was able to I had him run down to the courthouse to incorporate heceta. And it's been a few years, and our main focus is providing financial support for people who need medical treatment to have kids. We also provide awareness and train rabbis and try and network to other resources. And there are now 9 babies in the world because of, in part due to our work, ultimately, thank God. But in part due to our support, we have, I think we have a set of twins who are on the way, and I'm not sure if they were just born. No, that was someone else. We have twins that are due any minute. Okay. and 5 more people who are in the process.
Wow. That's amazing. I mean, so your organization is responsible for, depending on what time people are listening to this podcast, between 9 and 11 children, and they're more on the way. And this came out of your personal struggles and your personal need, and your experience in the world and in the Jewish world, and I want to just parse this for the audience, because this was a real profound truth for me to hear, was the idea that just so everybody knows, Jewish people love their children, not more than anybody else loves their children, but man, we really take it to 11. And once you have a baby in the Jewish world, there's all sorts of support available for Jewish education, for summer camps, for free books in the mail, things like that. But what about when you don't have that kid yet? And what support exists for that? And what kind of was there just nothing there in the Jewish world, and you felt like you had to start this to kind of scratch your own itch or meet your own need?
What does exist is mostly in certainly it's in the Haredi world. That's the ultra-Orthodox, very much on the right. And sometimes they lean to some people in the Orthodox world. And I think that some of them want to be open to everyone, but it's not really clear actually how much they really would serve in the Orthodox and non-Orthodox community, but certainly it's not comfortable. And I'm extremely comfortable in my Jewish skin, in my Jewish life, and I don't really feel comfortable going there. And I would have needed a particular rabbi's approval in order to get services. So in that part of the Jewish spectrum, there are millions of dollars being poured in there. I found singularly nothing else in the Jewish world that provided any form of support in any kind. Since we started, there have been a handful of other organizations, mostly local organizations, that provide support or funding and what. It's extremely limited. It's growing now. There's a lot of people getting interested in this.
It's all the more impressive that you've sort of picked up a flag and run out ahead of the flock so that you're going to inspire other people locally and nationally to do the same work. I'm sure of it. And as listeners to this podcast either know or will come to understand based on some conversations I've had with guests so far, the Jewish world is very diverse. And and we have all kinds. And sometimes when people aren't familiar with the Jewish community, and I do this in my Intro to Judaism class, draw a picture of a Jewish person, right? And the idea that someone has in their head is male, has a beard, has I'll say monochromatic clothing, and that is a wonderful part of our world, but doesn't represent our entire world. And also, there are some communities that are very, very open, and there are some communities just through the vicissitudes of history that have become very insular and sort of wary of interacting with other groups. And just this is true in every other religion that I've encountered. But as you saw, this group was being generous, but being more focusing on the needs of its own kind of local community. And sometimes it's hard to break through that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. To some degree, we all have to draw lines also. I can't support everyone who comes here, so I don't fault them. I wish them a lot of luck, but it was just kind of a sad statement in as much as there wasn't anything that extended outwards.
And can I ask sort of what are your lines? Like, who can Hasidah serve and who can Hasidah not serve at this point?
Our defining lines, because it's mostly around our funding, I pretty much will try and help anyone who calls me with support and referrals and resources, but so our funding.
Right. There are lots of resources you can provide that are not money, right? And information and things like that.
Yeah. And usually, and it makes sense because when donors give you money, it's people have a particular genre. So we've kind of defined that. Mostly it's basically that the people we serve are people who have said, we want to have Jewish children.
Okay.
So that's pretty much our requirement, that Judaism is going to be the sole religion practiced in the household where the child will be raised. If they're blessed with a child or lucky to have a child, a mix of the two. I'm trying to think, that's pretty much the one, that's about it, really.
Okay.
I mean, you got to have enough money to be able to support the child once you get the child. Right. Kind of basics like that.
It's just you're looking for sustainability and something that grows the future of our people in all sorts of ways, in numbers of feet on the ground, but also hearts and souls to contribute. And so that's amazing. Now, do you work out of your home or do you work in an office? Because I know this is a startup and startups can be tough.
I've been in and out and I feel like I just got released. I was working at home and I just got a new office space last week, which has been extremely excited. I had been home because I had taken my work very personally and had just actually, thank God, we had gone through IVF as well. And our very last embryo left. We had a baby. And so I had been home for a couple years and I just got an office last week again. I'm here in downtown Oakland, California.
Oakland.
Yeah.
So how are you enjoying Oakland?
I love it. I have a great view. It's kind of funny, actually. There's only a handful of billboards that I can see, and 4 of them are for a new fertility clinic that just opened up. And I actually happen to have just brought the doctor onto my advisory board. So when I look outside, it's actually pretty hysterical. I don't think you could be sitting almost anywhere getting the view of the fertility clinic in Oakland. And from my office.
Right. So you're saying,
I thought it was a good sign.
Babies after babies after babies. It sounds like 4 good signs. That's awesome. Any good falafel joints in Oakland, California?
There are. I have wandered out and found it was formerly a food truck and they brought it in-house. And it was excellent. But the real danger here is on the first floor, like part of this building on the way to the falafel joint, is a place called Donut Savant.
Okay. And, they sound focused.
I have not been there yet, but just the concept of it excites me.
That's awesome. Well, it sounds like you're growing by leaps and bounds, or one or two babies at a time. And so now I want to ask you some questions as a rabbi, from one rabbi to another. I've got a lot of people listening to this show. I hope I have a lot of people listening to this show. Are you listening to my show yet? Please listen to my show. This is an exercise in tautology. So I have some people who are listening to my show who aren't Jewish. I'm assuming. What's something that you would want people who aren't Jewish to know about Judaism or about Jewish people?
The funny thing I was going to say is we like to ask questions. That was a really good question.
Oh, thank you. I made it myself.
And it's a good one. There's a lot of ways to answer that. Like 3 things just popped into my head when you said that.
I got time.
Okay. So certainly there are 2 of them, and they're actually kind of random things. And one of the things that came to my mind was time, and the other was leadership. I really don't know why they came, but I think that they're kind of different. And one of the things that I find most fascinating about Judaism is that when we talk about like sacred spaces, we tend to think of synagogue when people focus so much on the sacred spaces or the holiness within each person, which I think is really true. But one of the beautiful things that I think that Judaism introduces, and others may well, but it's something I think we do well, is time, and how we parse that out. That when and I think about this as I teach this to my children because it's an extremely hard concept to understand. But even just like literally the passing of days, we observe it differently than the world around us, like from evening to morning, and of months. It's kind of funny. I'm extremely tuned into the lunar months, because of celebrating in the Jewish calendar. It's not just a solar calendar; it's a lunar calendar. So understanding the cycles of time around it. But I think most profoundly, though, is recognizing, like when we think about the very famous, there's a time to mourn and a time to be joyful and things like that. But like there's a time for resting, there's a time for Shabbat and for the Chagim. And the fact that especially in America, when I think one of the last things that we've gotten down to commodifying is time, I think it's extraordinarily powerful in our consumerist focused economy, and everything is about efficiency of time, to think about how we do say that there is a sacred time when those things are just not the priority, whether it is once a week on Shabbat or if it's on these holidays where we say that's really not our priority. Our priority here is to be, thankful that we were set free and we are no longer slaves in Egypt, that we have to take the time and say, we are grateful that God created the world and that our lives have been blessed to exist and we need to make them better and are pure, but that we set aside time. I think that's one of the really profoundly different approaches that Judaism has to life and humanity. Oh,
I agree. I think that's especially, I'm thinking of you on kind of the cusp of Silicon Valley, if I know my geography, and in a hyper-competitive time and place in America in 2018, we've wrung about all the productivity we can out of things.
Thanks for listening to the Jewcurious Show
at the atomic and molecular level and microprinting and all this stuff. And so we've kind of squeezed all the juice we can out of stuff, and out of space. And we've, with the internet's allowed us to kind of depart from real estate as a necessity almost in many ventures of our lives. Now what we're, and this has been throughout the 20th century, sort of squeezing all that we could out of time. And that's pushed us to be sort of always on, right? This sort of 24/7 cycle of connectivity and expectations of connectivity and expectations of being available and having a little anchor beeping in our pocket. The idea that we can set aside not just holy space with a wall with some, nice pictures and, Torah scrolls and things like that, but we can set aside time that becomes a sanctuary in itself. And I think a lot of, like some of my students get a lot out of Rabbi Heschel's book, The Sabbath, what talks about, whereas, as Rome and other cultures built sanctuaries and palaces in space, that is 3D extension, Judaism builds those sacred structures not out of space, but out of time, by Shabbat and holidays and the moon cycle and things like that. So I'm really glad you called that out.
Yeah. Thank you.
Tell me more about leadership.
Something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, both on the personal level as well as the communal level and the national level. And this comes from some reading I had done. It was such a short reading, but it's been reverberating throughout the year from some of the things that Rabbi Jonathan Sachs had written about leadership, and the idea that and there are historical reasons for this, and there are certainly religious reasons for this, but that in Judaism, when we think of leadership, people tend to think of someone who has power or authority. But Judaism is actually much more interested in influence than power, which seems kind of, if you're a traditionalist, you would say that doesn't make sense in anything at all, because we're all about halakha and rule and order. But one of the other things is that people know if there is a Jewish law, for example, then there's a way to get around it. But if there's a minhag, if there's a custom, then, oh my gosh, good luck. And that's like the perfect example. If there's a power and authority, you can throw it. But when someone has influence, that truly is leadership. And I also think about that in terms both of how we have evolved as a community, how we interact with like our government. And I just find it on so many levels to be very interesting. And there's so much about it. For example, so much of our legal system today in the Western world is based on a lot of what Judaism is, because even in the Talmud, our traditional text that is both interpretation of the Bible, as well as sometimes labeled correctly and incorrectly kind of a code of law. But even there, you can see that the way we thought about things was about influence, that the rabbis had personalities. And it wasn't always that the person in authority won. It was who had the most influence. And I also find that to be interesting when I do find that religion in the United States kind of comes under attack. A lot of people look at religion as like a dogma or very rigid. And I think that the funny thing about it is religion really has very little power. I mean, anyone here could just, not practice. There is no authority in religion anymore. Yet we can't quite grasp, why does it have such an influence on it? And I think in part it's because I personally believe that religion is ultimately, if it's effective anyways, that a good religion, and I'm a pluralist, could be, it is a doctrine or a way or a life view. It's any of those things. But ultimately the point is to make us more fully human and more meaningful. And I think that that's one of the reasons why that religion has influence on us, and it can feel threatening, because I think people ultimately want to lead meaningful lives. But yet when you feel that it's an authority, we reject it. So people reject religion, yet at the same time, it's still exerting such influence on it because we as humans crave that. So I find the whole idea of Judaism's perspective, I think, being much more about influence than power is just something that I think is unique in a different perspective. And it's through just so many different things: how we self-legislate, how we relate to our governments, how we look at individual participation. It also helps you see our different denominations, and our relationship to that influence and power is what segregates or separates, is probably more accurate, the different denominations. That's a little abstract, I grant you, but
it's a powerful idea. And I think, and I think about this a lot, especially lately. Sometimes I'll get a question from somebody, Rabbi, what's the right way to do this? Or what's the right way to do that? I've been on the internet and I've read 3 to 7 different ways. And so which is the right one? And it occurs to me that through much of Jewish history, and I'll get out of the Bible for a second, but just look at the anthropology and history of our people, we've been sort of isolated communities within isolated communities, right? From cities in Europe and in, North Africa and places like that, cities were sort of self-contained things anyway. And then the Jewish community within that city was more or less self-contained. And the the power or authority devolved, I was going to say to the rabbi, but I know that's not true. But like, even in Jewish law, the power devolves to the local rabbi. We don't have a pope, right? And so it's the person closest to the question being asked that is sort of given the honor as the final arbiter. And then the tradition of the community itself is even, as strong or sometimes even stronger than that. And it's only within the last, say, 100 years of population fluidity and then information fluidity that anybody is even aware of a different way to do things, right? You didn't have to ask what's the right way to light Shabbos candles because everybody in your town lit them the same way. But if I can go on Wikipedia or I can go on aish.com or Chabad.com or myjewishlearning.com and I see different opinions, suddenly I'm in a quandary that really has never existed before or hasn't in a long time. And so we don't have that kind of authority, but I'll say what you're talking about with influence is even older, right? Because it makes me think of, Abraham didn't have any power over God when God said, I hate to tell you this, but I'm about to wipe out a couple of cities, including one where your nephew lives. And Abraham said, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but if you do that, you're going to get kind of a reputation, sir, or ma'am, as the case may be. Yes. And then Moses does this a couple of times, like at the golden cow and with the spies. And Moses is saying, God's like, all right, I'm done. I'm going to wipe all these folks out. I'm going to start over with you, Moses. And Moses is like, look, not for me. But, do you want people saying that, oh, this God was only powerful enough to take people out of Egypt. He wasn't powerful enough to sustain them in the desert. Think about your own reputation, Hashem. And Moses was not only able to argue with God, but influence God in a certain way. And I recently had a conversation with Rabbi Brad Artson on a similar topic. And he's got this really, I think, profound way of looking at God that is not only, I'll say, kind of innovative in the world as it is, but also more native to Hebrew scriptures, and the notion that, God in the Hebrew scriptures wasn't this Aristotelian, infinite sphere, all powerful, all loving, all knowing, but really super powerful, super loving, super knowing. But the way he put it was that, you can't have something that is both, all loving and all powerful, because those two things just don't fit, like not even for God, and God doesn't break the laws of nature. And he says, you can, the native God to the Hebrew scriptures is all loving, but if God is all loving, can't be all powerful at the same time. But what that God does is exercises influence through setting examples of kindness and sometimes setting examples of justice. And God's power is only extended to us exercising free will based on that influence.
Well, I think what you just got to there, the free will, is also kind of the key. I mean, that's really what this comes down to, is influence is an exercise in free will. Power is not.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I say power, absolutely, not absolute power, but you're absolutely correct.
Right. Yeah.
So I want to ask a different question. There may be some people who are listening to this podcast who are in fact Jewish. And if so, do you have anything to say to somebody who, is Jewish their whole lives, born Jewish, but just doesn't feel either ready or able to connect with it? What would you want to teach that person?
Whenever I think of that question, I have to confess that, my rabbinate is not terribly dogmatic. So I tend to think about what it is that I want to know about this person. And because, again, I really do believe that for a religion to be effective, it makes your life meaningful. I think that I would kind of want to know, like, what are the person's, do they have struggles in life? Like, what makes you curious? I think that it's kind of also like whether, because for some people, Judaism isn't a strong part of their life because they weren't raised in it, or sometimes they were raised it in such a way that it didn't have meaning for them. But I think that one of the beautiful things, the rich things about Judaism is that it's supposed to be lived. I find it hard to hear criticisms about the legalistic and non-loving part parts of Judaism because I think it's incredibly rich with things that are both relevant to the day-to-day in our life, as well as like extremely deep theological messages, teachings for us to garner from it. And it's incredibly, I don't want to say rational because I feel like it's belittling it, but I think so what's going through my mind is I keep thinking, what might be a time when someone like feels the absence of religion? And the first thing that came to my mind as I thought that to myself, trying to answer your question, was like when someone dies. And a lot of times people will go through their lives and it's not meaningful. But as rabbis, I know in my training, we talk about the fact that when death is involved, people tend to get really traditional.
That's true.
At least if they're facing it. And I appreciate that there is a role for denial when it comes to death, but when someone wants to face it, it's just these profound questions. And one of the things that strikes me about Judaism is it's extremely pragmatic about death. It's not something, it's just such a great example. Like our views on what happens after we die are extremely diverse because we don't really have too much evidence to counterbalance it. So almost any thought about what happened after death, you could find that in there, and we don't focus on it so much. But how we deal with death is just terribly compassionate. I find it really is this amazing balance of like justice and CASAD, of loving kindness, that we help people really process the reality of what it is through the most compassionate way. And for example, like when we say, there's a tradition that when someone has lost one of their close relatives, we don't ask them how they're doing. They're not responsible for anything. That the only thing they're really responsible for is feeling what they're feeling.
Okay.
They're obligated to nothing at that point in time. And all of the different rituals, all the different theology around death, just to me, are like the example of when it comes to the things that are truly like the most important things about our humanity. I just feel like Judaism has some very rich and beautiful and meaningful practices and teachings around it. We may not always be the best at fulfilling them, or rabbis might not always be the best. Trying to think of the word in English, a misaderet, like a person who organizes it or transmits it.
Right.
But I think that Judaism is just terribly relevant. So if someone came up to me and said, I know I'm Jewish, I don't really know what it means, I think I'd want to start with like, what's something in your life that is meaning for you? And show how Judaism can help make it a richer experience and can help contextualize it in a way that brings sacred and human deeply on both sides. I think the intersection of the two are brought out through just about everything.
Well, I agree with everything you just said, and I think it's a wonderful way to frame it. I want to dig a little deeper just to make it more real, especially for people in the audience who haven't had these kinds of experience. Maybe they haven't processed mourning through like within a Jewish community. So can you think of an example of a Jewish practice that has really given your life a lot of meaning, or a particular mitzvah that is sort of your favorite aspect of Judaism, or something that's really helped you in a certain moment?
There are too many, but I will just answer the one that came to my mind. The first thing that popped to my mind is the blessing we say before eating. And it's one of my favorite teachings because I think that there are so many, like anyone who has any intention of stopping and making something meaningful, there is a Jewish practice for it. But I think of sometimes like on a given day, even though I'm just having a really bad day, there are a couple rabbis who pretty much say that the secret to happiness is gratitude. And Judaism kind of believes in like 100 blessings a day. It's kind of hard. For example, I was going to say prayer, but the truth is it's kind of hard to sit down and just say, Baruch atah, all of these, praised are you, God, praised are you, praised are you. It's very hard to get yourself motivated by that, but you got to eat. You have to eat.
That's true. I recommend it to everyone.
It's pretty much essential to life. And In fact, metabolism is one of the 3 things that make you a living being. I find it amazing. One of the teachings that we were talking about like, why do we say a blessing before we eat? Because actually, traditionally, we get straight from the Torah that you actually technically are required to say a blessing after you eat. That once you are saying in Hebrew and translate in my head, once you've eaten and you're satisfied, then you thank. But
which is another very pragmatic teaching of Judaism, I think.
Yes, right. Because it's so easy if you're starving to be like, oh, thank you, I got this food. Oh, it's so great. But then to be satisfied and say, thank you, when you could just like get up and walk away. Yeah, I got everything I need, whatever, I go on. So like, that's one thing also, is to remember to say thank you after you eat. I think is an amazing way. But just the idea of thanking our food, to realize I do this exercise, and we do it with an apricot, mostly because I like to say mish mish. It's such a great word. And but the idea of when you look at this and you have to say a blessing before you eat it, and it's like, why? And you just ask the question, like, where did this? So you could just eat whatever. Like, I'm sitting here at my desk and I have a cup of water and I have my little blueberries over here, which are going to be my snack when we're done eating. I'm like, whatever, I can just nibble at them and thoughtlessly eat them as I continue on my day. But if you just stop for 1 second and you look at the blueberry or your apricot, and you ask the question, like, where did this come from? And you think, well, it came from, like in the apricot's case, a tree. Okay, great. Where did the tree come from? It came from a seed. Where did the seed come from? Another tree. Where did that come from? A seed, a tree, a seed, a tree, a seed. And like Judaism says, and that goes all the way back to creation. Like, where did the first seed come from? Right? And ultimately, had you not taken that apricot from the tree, like, it doesn't totally work in the sense that we're in this now massive supermarket thing and you can get them whatever. But imagine you're picking up from the tree. If you didn't pick that one, what if it landed in the ground and planted a tree? What could that lead to? Another one. And another one, another one. And it could be going all the way till the end of time. So every time you take that little apricot and you put it in your mouth, or any of these things that are food, like, ultimately it could have gone all the way back to the beginning of time, because that's anything we eat was living, at least I hope. It's not getting genetically modified or whatever. But like in traditional foods, it goes all the way to the beginning of time and it goes all the way into the time. So a lot of times, the simple thing for me to do in a day to bring holiness to my day is just to stop and like have that one moment when I say my blessing over my food. And it's such a centering experience to recognize everything around me preceded me in time. And this little piece of fruit that could have, come from the seed, this has an essence in it from God and creation. And if I weren't in here, it could be going all the way to the end of time when the world is saved, or, Moshiach comes, however your belief is, just from this little piece of fruit.
Wow. I'm going to think about lunch very differently now. I have to admit. I love that teaching of gratitude being the basis of happiness. And I think that's very true. I mean, it's like it's in Pirkei Avot, like who is wealthy, is the one who is satisfied, I'll use that word again, with his or her portion, right? If you can appreciate what you have, that's wealth. Because here's the thing, it doesn't matter how much you have if you don't appreciate it. There's no sensation of wealth at all. Right. But I've never connected this to the kind of the Jewish continuity of space-time, right? This going back to the beginning unto the end, and in some teachings it's sort of circular, but you're sort of you and this bit of sustenance are meeting at random out of that whole continuum. And why not be thankful for that, right? And why not use that as a moment to connect to something way bigger than yourself?
Now, granted, we can't sustain that throughout our day.
That sounds exhausting.
It's pretty hard to live. I know. That's why I was like, the reality is, that's what I said. The reality is I'm going to eat my blueberries. I'm probably going to, I'll stop for a second and I will say thank you for them. Yeah. And then I'm going to sit in front of my computer and keep eating. But like the fact that you have the accessibility to just stop at any moment and have that groundedness, and granted, many religious traditions can offer that too. But Judaism has something for everything. Like to recognize, like that is what the moment of saying that Baruch Atah and thanking God for giving me this fruit of the earth, like those opportunities abound. So like if someone just says, like, what's a basic thing that I could do in my life to make me have, much more of a sense of my being and my connection to the divine, give them an answer. Bless your food.
Right. It's an easy place to start and an effective one too.
Multiple times a day.
Do you have any advice for people who may be listening who are considering converting to Judaism, or maybe, going to the mikveh tomorrow? Like, what do they need to know about this family they're joining?
Well, we're a family. We're a family with all of that lovely, amazing, complicated, messy. We got it all. What advice would I say? I actually thoroughly enjoyed working with conversion candidates in the past. And one of the things, I think it's beautiful that you use the word family, I would often towards the end.
Yeah, I have to pause and give kavod to Rabbi Adam Greenwald, who kind of gave me that model for thinking of the Jewish people as not, necessarily exclusively a religion or exclusively a stock or a people, but as a family in the sense, because it encompasses all of those things. And families have this kind of permeable membrane that you can kind of join a family, you can leave a family. But it's nonetheless binding. It's nonetheless embracing, and it accommodates such diversity, and still, and you can disagree with people all you want, but at some point of extremes, we just have each other's back. So I just wanted to just thank Rabbi Greenwald for that.
I think it's a great, lovely, almost every analogy and comparison that's coming out of it, I think, is just right on.
Right. But I hijacked your answer. So what do you tell to your candidates?
So towards the end, one of the things also, though, about what you're saying is, and it goes back also, by the way, to people who are Jewish, is I think one of the most complicated things about a family, and you even touched it in saying about why you started, is the idea of we. The idea of us. That a lot of times when people are going through conversion, there's things that you can know how to do, and you may know a fact, you may feel excited about this. It's really hard to feel the we. Think about that, like when we say, when we go up to Torah, which is oftentimes when someone goes through conversion, they may be called up to Torah, something, and we say, Asher Bachar Banu, who chose us, or all of these things, Vitzivanu, who commanded us. And we have to use this term, us. And I think that it really goes back to what you said, because there are also some Jews who don't feel that sense of we. It's just like in a family, when you have someone who kind of felt like, well, I was treated like a black sheep, I'm not really part of the family. But the reality is, like, they're still your parents. It's still your sister. Like, you can disassociate all you want, but like the bond is there. And I think it's one of the things that in working with conversion candidates that I think is important to kind of recognize the beauty of that and the difficulty of that, because sometimes it takes a while to feel we. And even again, some of us who, like, I was born Jewish, but I was not raised in an observant family whatsoever. And even that alone took me a time to kind of feel the sense of we. I felt like an outsider for a long time. And I think just to recognize, like, that's okay, because that's normal, even a family, to kind of every once in a while be like, oh my God, they're crazy. I'm not a part of their family. I don't want to be in the Michigan, whatever. But like what you said, though, like when the tough times are there, like, we got to remember their family. So just the concept of we and community, and especially because it's not monolithic. It goes back to what we said at the beginning too. Like, we tend to think of, like, a lot of people, especially because we're a small people, tend to think of Jews as like this one, like there's Judaism and there's this massive spectrum. There's lots of little sub-we's. Our we as a community. And yet, yes, there's every family, there's every city, there's the shul that you will go to, the shul that you won't step foot into. The whole concept of we, I think, is just something that's important for someone who is about to be converting, or someone who has not been really affiliated or involved coming in. It's important to understand that, because we are not like a faith community like the Christian community, where if you profess a faith, you're in. Like, we're so much more complicated. I could say, I don't even believe a thing, and yet you're still in.
Yep. I just want to unpack an important piece of Jewish literature that you touched upon that not everybody may be aware of. And that's the joke about, every Jewish person has every Jewish person has at least two synagogues. And actually the joke is better. So I'll say it this way. There was a Jewish person who was stranded on a desert island, and after 20 years, a ship is sailing by and sees his fire and goes over to him and says, well, your clothes are in tatters. How long have you been here? 20 years, give or take. And let me show you what I've done and upgraded the space. And, he's very much like the professor from Gilligan's Island. He's made all sorts of amazing things out of coconuts and palm fronds. And this is the thing I'm most proud of. And he shows them that he's made a little synagogue, just big enough for one person to stand in and pray. But it's beautiful. It's architecturally, he's made like a geodesic dome situation. Everything's there, and they're admiring it. And then one of the shipmates looks over down the shore and says, well, what's that building? And he's like, well, that's a synagogue. And they said, well, what about that synagogue? He's like, I wouldn't step foot in there.
Always got to be that place we don't go to.
Yeah, that's it. Like every Jew has the synagogue they go to and the one they wouldn't be caught dead in. But I think we probably share that with other population groups as well. Before we go, what do you think is important for people to know about your organization, CASAD? Like, what's a struggle that somebody might be going through where you can really help them?
I think that one of the things kind of also goes back to your question about Judaism. I think that nowadays we kind of forget that literally the stories of infertility go back to the Bible. Literally having babies is kind of timeless. Like we didn't exist unless you could have a baby and reproduce. And yet one of the first reactions that we've had through time for a variety of reasons is to hide it. We've hidden miscarriages. People didn't talk about it. It was taboo. And part of this has to do with the development of religion and all those things and superstition and whatnot. But to me, I just think it's amazingly beautiful that we have an organization, a CASAD, and I also have some colleagues around the country who started an organization that we kind of recognize that we live in a different world, and not only are there medical advances to help this, but isn't a profoundly meaningful experience in your life to make the decision. We kind of take it for granted that we're going to become a parent. We're just going to decide, and I'm going to become a parent, but you're going to create another life. It's extraordinarily profound, and we don't really talk about that. We spend so much time like, don't even touch her. You will get pregnant. Don't do anything. And so we just kind of assume it's going to work and you get a baby and it's really easy. But it is one of the most miraculous, amazing things that happens. So the people who face these challenges and learn, we get people who learn they're genetic disease carriers. They've had multiple miscarriages. Some of them like amazing things that your bodies can do and can't do, syndromes and illnesses, cancer survivors, all sorts of reasons why. And all of a sudden they grapple with this question that, wait, what do you mean I can't have a kid? Like if you go back to the story of the mishmish or the blueberry, like all of a sudden you realize, wait a minute, I'm connected in my life all the way back to the beginning of time, but like, bam, I'm cut off from the future. And it just pulls a rug out from underneath them they never knew. Like it's not continuing on. So to be able to support people during that period in life to address these extraordinarily profound questions has been, I wasn't really a big thing of thinking people had a calling. I've been called to do this. It's been the most extraordinary, meaningful work I've ever done to talk with people as they grapple with those questions and struggle with it. And thank God with the cases that I've worked with, most of them go on somehow to become parents. It's just like the most rewarding thing on earth. I think to be able to be a witness to someone going through that creative process to grapple with these meaningful experiences in their life. And it's kind of shocking to me that organizations like this to help people through that haven't existed. I imagined in the past, like the closest thing would be like birth workers or doulas that help women give birth, very hands-on. But we're also like doing the counseling and recognizing for the people who can't do it and helping them to be able to do it. It's extraordinarily powerful, profound work. And I'm just thrilled that I think one thing that CASAD has done is raise the conversation. And now there are more organizations coming up. And because of what we're doing and building awareness, more people getting involved, because it's just, I tend to think it's one of the most human, as I said earlier, it's just the most amazing experience if this is what you choose to do in your life to be able to have it. So to enable people to do it has been the holiest work I've ever done.
I want to take a moment to say a blessing that may be improvised, but I want to bless God for giving you the calling that you have and for, with your help, bringing this organization into the world, because it sounds like God's work, and it sounds like it's incredibly fulfilling work for you, and all the more so it's a blessing for the people who need that work done in the world. And so, if I'm not mistaken, if there's anybody listening to this, if this is something you're struggling with, this realization wherever you're at that maybe the thing that you've taken for granted of bringing life into the world is blocked from you somehow, and you want to bring Jewish souls into the world, then I would encourage you to get in touch with Rabbi Solomon at CASAD, and we'll put all that contact in the show notes. What's the best way for people to get in touch with you?
Send me an email, idit@chasida.org, or give me a call. Our number's on our website. We're chasida.org on the web. It's all there.
Fantastic. And I'll put that in the show notes as well. Rabbi Solomon, thank you so much for having this conversation with me. This was a blast. It was fun, philosophical, and I don't know an F word for profound, but I'll leave that to everybody's imagination. So it was profoundly amazing. So
Thanks for having me.
Always great to talk to you. And I'm sure the Jewcurious folk out there have gotten a lot out of this, and there will be more to come. So thank you so much for having this conversation with me. And I'll see you at the next Rabbis Without Borders alumni retreat, if I don't get up to Oakland falafel and donut savant before that.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hero, thank you for hanging out for this dope conversation with my friend and colleague and fellow Rabbi Without Borders, Rabbi Idit Solomon. If you want to connect with CASAD or Rabbi Solomon herself, or click to any of the resources that we've mentioned in this episode, go ahead to the show notes, which are on the internet at jewcurious.show/episode 2. That's the word episode, no space, number 2, and see all the resources and contact info that we have listed there. In addition to those resources, there's one more resource I want to point your attention to, and that is something I've created just for people who are trying to observe the mitzvah, the Jewish blessing of Shabbat, that is our weekly day of rest given to us by the Holy One. People who are trying to observe that, but sometimes are hitting roadblocks, sometimes are hitting potholes, detours, or just feeling frustrated with how their Shabbat experience is going. It happens. It happens to me. If it's happening to you, you should click on a link in the show notes to the 6 rookie mistakes that people make when they're enjoying Shabbat and how to avoid them. That's a handy multi-page guide that I have prepared just for you and anyone else suffering from these frustrations, and I wanted to make sure you know about it. Couple more things before we sign off for this episode. First, I want to remind you to subscribe if you have not done so already. That way we can stay connected and keep learning together. Finally, if you've gotten any value out of this episode, if you've learned something that's really going to help you out with a problem that you have, or you've just enjoyed our philosophical and theological waxings, not to mention restaurant tips in Oakland, California, I'd like you to please consider leaving this show a rating. There's a little star thingy on iTunes and possibly other platforms as well. Go ahead and let me know what you think of this show. That's not only helpful for me to know how we're doing, it's also helpful for people who need this show but might not be able to find it. And the more people who rate the show, the easier it is to find. Depending on your rating, you may want to warn people away. I don't know. You do you. And last thing, if you're feeling extra generous, I would love it if you would leave a comment about this show in the rating system. Just give it some stars. You decide how many, and write a little review. Once again, that lets me know how I'm doing on this show. It lets other people know if this show is valuable for them. And if you do that for me and the other listeners, potential and actual, I would be most obliged. Hero, thanks again for listening to this show. Until next time, peace.
Thanks for listening to the Jewcurious Show at www.jewcurious.show.